very much, Kerry, and thanks all for your attention. I'd like to start my talk today with also with a quote. Al Gore is we've sort of dropped him off the radar a little bit, but he's a great one for quotes on this subject. And he talks about the fact that if you were to drive a car straight up autobahn speeds, you reach the top of the sky in 5 minutes. And into that thin layer, we put 162 million tons of CO2 every year. So there's a massive I think it's every day, actually, every day. So there's a massive challenge to address here. And business models is really where I focus. So that's taking that investment and releasing it into the construction of this infrastructure system. So I'm gonna skip over this, but I want to start with the global recognition, which has been made very clear now by the likes of the IEA and also by governments around the world, of the essential role that CCS will play in decarbonising our industries and our populations, our cities, in the run up to achieving net zero. So you can see the UK example here, where this bright fuchsia wedge here represents the role that CCS has been assessed to be playing within UK decarbonisation. And on the right, the purple wedge there is CCS going up to 2070, achieving net zero at the global level, as assessed by the IEA. So it's around 20% of the answer, CCS. So it's an absolutely essential technology set, and brilliant again to be here today working on that. It is a combination of technology and economics which will make it happen. Again, just reinforcing this point, and I do think it's worth reinforcing even to an audience like we have today, it is the single best near-term implement, says an academic, Wake Smith from Cambridge University, obstinately unused tool. The only way to decarbonise cement, one of the most used materials, one of the two most used materials with steel in the world, produced in almost every country in the world, and having no other way to decarbonise its production. One of the only technologies capable of reducing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Another quote from Al Gore is about the bathtub. The bathtub is filling up. We need to switch off the taps by decarbonising our current industry, but after that, we still have a full bathtub. And CCS is the only way to take those emissions out of the atmosphere and permanently and safely store them underground. And of course, we've had several conversations today about the importance of communication and to bring the public with us. Well, actually, in the organisations which have the fantastic resources and to have made enormous margins since Ukraine on the production and use of gas, also, in many cases, have the expertise to lead those communication campaigns and have done so successfully over many years in relation to the original development of those hydrocarbon resources, and have learned lessons in that process that we can use. So, of course, many of these examples will be familiar to those in the room. CCS is a known technology set. There are uncertainties, and I'll come back to some of those across the full CCS chain. But CCS has been in deployment for over 20 years. In Salah in Algeria, some of the longest operating stores, which are not mentioned enough in many ways, we've got information about the deformation, which some of the geologists have spoken or referenced in the talk so far, and have also got evidence of air pressure and other well characteristics over that full period, all in the public domain. Gorgon, has been a problematic project, and we've learned lots of lessons there also, but particularly in relation to water, also in relation to regulation and the importance of a strong regulation and movements being made, which can be met. In Northern Lights and in Sleipner, we've talked a lot about Sleipner, and of course, there again, we have some of the longest track record and the longest data being produced. But the greatest story, the largest volume of storage of CO2 right now is actually in the Brazilian pre-salt, where CCS is in operation for, admittedly, for advanced recovery of hydrocarbons. But that's happening directly from floating from FPSOs. So the development of the direct-to-ship injection is well underway, and the volumes there are extremely significant. So I've got, the previous speakers pointed to a trajectory of investment from the Bloomberg data. A similar illustration here, specifically for CCS from the FT, looks again at that very, very exponential and steep upward curve in terms of investment. And of course, what you can also see here is the maturation of projects from concept and feasibility rapidly into advanced development, and tipping off through FID, and into detailed design. So, these projects are now advancing, and we are in the business of building a new global infrastructure system. The illustration in the bottom right there is the laying of some of the CO2 ships which are being built, and now 3 have actually left this shipyard for the Northern Lights project. So carrying for CO2 is a technology which is also understood, and that was one of the last sort of gaps in many ways in terms of the full chain CCS. Of course, there are still gaps, and some of them we've touched on, and we will touch on again. So why isn't CCS at scale yet? This is the kind of burning question that many of us ask ourselves, or despite, celebrating the progress we have made, we actually need it to be at scale already in many ways. Well, we've seen cancellation of major projects. In the UK, we're in what we call wave 3 of CCS now, where we started upwards of 15 years ago to develop commercially viable CCS projects. Kings North and White Rose are both related to decarbonisation of coal, but across the world, a whole range of CCS projects have faltered, usually a combination of factors boiling down to economics. Because in many ways, CCS still struggles to be economically viable at scale. And what's happening now is that the pressing nature of the circumstances we're in, the kind of changes we're starting to see, are tipping that balance. We're hearing populations become more supportive, and therefore governments become more supportive, and therefore the economics starting to work. So, we do have to ask some serious questions about why the oil and gas sector, which has known and understood the technology for many decades, hasn't successfully taken it to greater scale. But I think we are starting collectively to answer those questions and to address that gap. Quest in Alberta, the Shell project, which has been operating for around 15 years, has a wealth of operational data, again, and often a gap in CCS, of how the plume is operating, and that's made publicly available through the city of Calgary. Picture below that is of the tanks which were completed now at Northern Lights. That's from last November. And of course, we have to consider the rest of the world. We're not, in Europe, we're in quite a special place in terms of CCS, and in the UK and in the US. Parts of the world are still starting to develop their oil and gas reserves for good, in many ways, economic reasons in those local environments. And it's a very difficult place to actually begin to judge or to criticize that approach. And they have very good reason for saying, well, you just developed your reserves, and you're not going to tell us not to do ours when we need the economic reality. We need the economics so badly. So some real challenges to address in those parts of the world. And of course, it's one single picture. It's one single diameter of sky that we're dealing with. So it's important to work across the world, and not just in individual regions, and to share the learnings that we gain. So I think if this will let me flick forward, does it? Is that the one? So, what some of the challenges that we're starting to address, and to summarize lessons learned in those countries, which the UK is included, who can't afford the massive subsidies that the US has managed to plug into the development of the energy transition technologies, including CCS. Consistency in the policy landscape is what we can reach for. And it was great to hear from the EU representative today as to the plans there. Integration with emitter technologies and the development of the infrastructure system to transport the CO2 is also, of course, an essential step, and we're starting to see that take shape. But of course, we still have countries around the world who have a growth imperative and need to develop their natural resources to fight poverty. And so we need to consider as well how we can manage a trajectory when the economics are so stark. So a couple of solutions which are starting to emerge, and I wanted to talk. This is not necessarily a fully comprehensive list, but these are three, and there are more details that we can certainly go into. But these three of the key business models which are emerging now, and which are enabling the development of CCS. Of course, none of this happens unless a capital investor can see an economic return in putting their money into these projects. And those balances are changing and are shifting as the environmental questions become more pressing. But this remains an essential building block and will remain the case. So US, the massive injection of cash that was represented by IRA boosted what was already called the 45Q tax credit mechanism, which provides support to companies planning to capture and store CO2. And as was mentioned, the tax credit becomes available when the molecules are first injected. So it's an incentivization on the storage of the CO2, which then the rest of the chain can start to benefit from. Now, of course, we've currently got a government who's supportive of that in the US, and that may not be the case for long. So we have to bear in mind the possibility of vulnerability in this regime, and that poses a serious challenge for investors who, of course, are looking for a longer term level of certainty. We've seen some quite odd and interesting effects as a result of the IRA and the 45Q, including, for example, the purchase of a large direct air capture company, Carbon Engineering, by an upstream oil and gas developer, Occidental, for EOR. So they're actually paying for some of the most expensive way to capture CO2 available from the air at very low concentrations in order to then use it for enhanced oil recovery. Strange economics. And as you look at the 45Q, and you see that they'll be therefore able to access $180 a ton direct air capture credits, as well as 85 tons perhaps for industrial emissions, and certainly the subsidy also available for enhanced oil recovery using CO2. So some of these mechanisms, albeit generous, still need to be honed and adapted and to be made overall sustainable, because what business investors need is clarity and continuity of these regimes. What's happening in the UK is very interesting, and it's also interesting to see how to be frank, how little it's kind of publicised and understood more widely. What's developing in the UK is effectively a utility. So carbon capture and storage will be regulated like a utility. And what that means is using something called the RAB, or the Regulated Asset Base model, whereby managers of the infrastructure are given an allowance of capex and opex, which they are, and a margin for profit, which they negotiate in advance from the government, who remains in control of that infrastructure. And they are then given a margin which tends to be in the region of 6 to 12%, so very low for compared to some of the margins which are accessible in conventional oil and gas, for example. And in the model, all investors have clarity and continuity, and the utility is provided as a service to the public and regulated like telecoms, like electricity, like water distribution. So that is a model which has been very long in the preparation, and lots of terms have now been agreed with Eni, the Italian upstream operator who is involved in the first hub, as well as nearly agreed with BP, who are developing the Teesside hub that was mentioned previously. So we've got two major hubs in the UK in the first track of CCS. One is HyNet on the west, and the other one is called the East Coast Cluster on the east, which is BP's involvement. So in both cases, a regulated utility is being developed. Now, regulated utilities in the UK have been very investable for many years, particularly under the management of, for example, National Grid PLC. But this is, let's say, a 10 to 12% return business. It is in a predictable way, but not a massive earner in the way that oil and gas has historically been. So we're looking at a big mindset shift, but nonetheless an investable proposition. And then thirdly, EOR or gas sweetening. So, in the majority of places around the world where CCS is now in operation, that's because the CO2 is coming out of CO2-rich methane streams, which need to have their CO2 removed in order for that gas to be commercially viable. And that's the case, for example, in the Brazilian pre-salt and in much of the Southeast Asian places where CCS is being developed. So that is very problematic from an environmental perspective, of course. However, it also provides a sound economic model for the development of the technology and the infrastructure. So when you combine with that some of the environmental pressures now being seen in Southeast Asia, Jakarta, the capital of the fifth largest economy, is moving to the rising sea levels. Coastal limits, people are losing up to 2 to 3 meters a year in terms of coastline to rising sea levels. You start to see a real impetus behind the development based on EOR and sweetening. So very briefly, conscious of time, we've talked about some of these challenges, but right along the CCS chain, there are some real hurdles still being worked out. On the capture side, we haven't talked much, and that could be a separate conversation. But certainly, there are challenges with things like amine-based capture, which produces a toxic waste. In the UK and in many parts of Europe, that waste of the saturated amine will need to be incinerated. Of course, that will create the re-release of that CO2 that's been very expensively captured. So it is essential that regulators understand the possible dangers of amines as a capture mechanism and the alternatives, which are fast developing in the capture space, including these listed here, filtration and metal organic frameworks, or MOFs, among the leading alternatives to amines. A company called Svante has received 500 million in Series E investment funding. So again, another important leg often overlooked of the economics of CCS is the supply chain. This is a report that my team and I did for the UK government, which was looking at where in the CCS supply chain, i.e. pipelines, compressors, ships, upstream exploration, reservoir engineering, advisory services can there be value for the UK. And similarly, similar exercises going on in the EU at the moment. And of course, this is another important area of the economics of CCS, is understanding how we can benefit, how communities and around the world can not only need to kind of meet acceptance in relation to CCS, but actually can stand to benefit from that development, whether through engineering services, which are massively constrained in the EU against the targets that the EU is seeking to achieve. There's a massive shortage of engineering resources and capabilities into the order of 9/10 of what's actually required is actually not looking like being available. So there's a massive gap in terms of construction and engineering management services. Also, there's massive bits of capex involved in the process of CCS. So there's lots of provisions, and we've highlighted a few in particular. And this is a study which is worth doing in all jurisdictions, seriously looking at CCS, because it's a helpful leg of the economic model. So looking at some of the key next steps, and I'll wrap up with this and just one more thing, if I may, Kerry. I can really, yeah, okay. So an economic model is essential, particularly for countries around the world who depend on their oil and gas resources, and for those where they cannot get the public support without a clear model which will produce revenue, local revenue. Investment grade financing, we're now about to see that take place in the next few weeks. Hopefully in the UK, we're going to receive bank support for our TNS networks. So I do hope that conversation with the EU is accelerated to meet that opportunity. Sustainability in the long term of supports. And in countries like Nigeria, which has experienced a terrible, where I was last week, has experienced considerable distress as a result of years and years of extraction. How do we then transition that to a country which can potentially store its CO2? So in conclusion, key levers, carbon price, and of course harmonisation in our case with the EU ETS is essential. As close as we can get to a global carbon price, the better. Predictability and governance mechanisms supported by public acceptance, which needs to be managed. A market for hydrogen as a tradable commodity, and indeed for CO2 as a tradable commodity, is the nirvana that we all, in many ways, are working towards. As soon as those ships are moving around the world and are tradable, a whole lot of investors and governments can get behind that model and can see it as a future which is fully investable and which therefore can stand on its own 2 feet. And of course, regulation to support that integrated market model. So things like the London Protocol and the building on from that at an international level outside of Europe too. So that's conclusion. And yeah, it's great to be here. So I'll hand back to you.